Welcome to Telegeography Explains the Internet, the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and we're in the midst of our special series all about the key issues in the global submarine cable industry. Today, our topic is submarine cable routing, and for that, my guest is James Porter, who is cable route engineer at Alcatel Submarine Networks. So where exactly do operators place their submarine cables, and why does this matter? Even among those of you listening that are very familiar with the submarine cable market, many of you maybe don't think much about where exactly on the seafloor these cables are actually being laid and what goes into determining those locations. Well, my guest James spends his days looking at maps to properly route submarine cables and ensure ease of maintenance and compliance with guidelines, among other key factors. You're going to hear us discuss the challenges of seabed congestion, particularly in deep water areas where new cables have to be laid at a safe distance from existing ones. James is going to highlight the role of the International Cable Protection Committee, the ICPC, and its recommendations for planning new cables to avoid impacting existing systems. We're going to touch on the complexities of geopolitics and physical geography, which often restrict cable routes and force them into congested choke points. Finally, James emphasizes the critical need for better communication and data sharing among industry players to make sure that we can efficiently and safely manage the crowded seabed. So, please, before you get into the interview, remember to subscribe, like the show, rate it, tell a friend to listen. And of course, feel free to find me and my guests on LinkedIn with suggestions and feedback. Okay, on to the interview. Welcome to the podcast, James.
Thanks. Hi, Greg. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to learn all about this topic. So before we jump in, though, I always ask my guests to give just a brief background on your whole career, and then, of course, especially what you're doing as a route engineer at ASN.
Yeah, okay. So currently I work at Alcatel Submarine Networks, one of the big turnkey submarine cable suppliers. And before Alcatel, I worked as a surveyor, so I was working offshore. I graduated from Plymouth University with a degree in ocean exploration, which is essentially hydrographic surveying. And then I went on to work for one of the big UK-based offshore survey companies. So we'd go and survey wind farms, pre and post surveys for wind farms, and we'd update nautical charts for the UK Hydrographic Office, things like that. But then I sort of got a little bit tired of the long offshore rotations and was looking for something office-based. So I did a little bit of project management at my previous company. And it was actually during one of those projects that I worked on a submarine cable route survey. And that was my first introduction into submarine cables, which is actually amazing because I'd done many years offshore surveying the seabed, but I had
Yeah, you think you would have run into them at some point, right?
yeah, really, really naive level exposure to them.
You know,
So I
that's
did
true
that.
for everybody that gets their way into telecom, right? So it's just something that you really only know about if you're in the industry to some extent, and of course that's what we're trying to help with here. You know, so.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the cable route engineer, my role as well is nobody sort of graduates from university with a degree in cable route engineering.
Right.
All of my colleagues, we've all got such a real eclectic mix of backgrounds. But the survey background, I think, is one of the more appropriate ones because at least you have a familiarity with the seabed and things nautical. So I came on shore, did a bit of project management, and then had the opportunity to join Alcatel, which I took and have been here for 4 years now as a cable route engineer.
Yeah, well, in this way, in the evenings, you could go out to the pub or go for a bike ride, or
Absolutely,
very different than maritime life, right? So
yeah. I
excellent.
mean,
All right, so,
excellent experience offshore. Loved it,
yeah,
but yeah, nice to
absolutely,
be on.
yeah. Well, and I love having those backgrounds in the actual sort of geography. I have geography background. I did a little bit of survey work myself, actually, for an archaeological kind of company. So I love that. Map making is exactly what is near and dear to our heart, right? So yeah, and that's very much what we're talking about today. You presented a paper at SubOptic all about submarine cable routing, and obviously lots of mapping there, and so it's a great way to start thinking about that. Could you just tell us briefly about what the paper was about, and especially why you think this paper was necessary to present at this major conference this year?
Yeah, so my role as a route engineer, I spend a lot of time sitting in front of the computer designing new routes for submarine internet cables. And we have a lot of external factors to consider: geopolitics, the seabed itself,
Hmm.
what it looks like, seabed features, other seabed users, wind farm operators, oil and gas. But what it seems, the more sort of experience I've gained, the biggest uh, challenge is navigating around existing fiber optic cables that are already
Hmm.
on the seabed. And in certain parts of the world, it's just becoming more and more of a challenge to achieve compliant routes. We have certain industry standards that we try to stick to, and it's just becoming a real challenge to design routing that's as straight and as direct as the customer would like, but also
Right.
complies with industry standards.
Yeah, that's a great point. So most people listening have some idea about this, but to drive it home, the route that the customer wants and the most direct route is actually not just sort of an economy of fiber or something like that. It's of course going to impact the latency of the cable. That's often how they're competing with each other, right? And believe it or not, shaving a few milliseconds off here and there really can sort of be important to certain customers, right? So I think thinking about it from that standpoint is fascinating, and also just that we're in the midst of this series in the podcast about submarine cables in general. It's something that obviously at Telegeography we talk about a lot, but that means there's a lot of cables out there. It's so crucial to the world, to the industry, to the global economy. But it's getting crowded, right? So why don't you tell us about the ICPC and what role they play, and what you were just talking about of sort of managing what the industry regulation should be about how cables interact on the seafloor.
Yeah, sure. So obviously the cables are tiny. Famously they're sort of the size of a hose pipe, no bigger than your
Hmm.
garden hose on in the deep water. So the reason we have a congestion issue is because we need to be able to maintain those cables. We need to be able to recover them, to be able to fix them if they do break. And in deep water, where we've just surface laid them, um, the method of recovery is the same as it's been, for the last 80 years. It's just a grapnel, so we have to just hook
Hmm.
them. So where you've got two cables running parallel to each other, you need to make sure you are sufficiently separated from that other cable so that you don't hook it when you're recovering your system. So the ICPC is the International Cable Protection Committee. They produce a list of different recommendations for all different factors of submarine cables. The one I'm most interested in is recommendation number 2, which discusses planning new cables in proximity to existing systems. And
Hmm.
it has a set number of rules about how close we can get to a third party cable with our new system. And that's generally a three times, it's a function of water depth. So
Hmm.
3 times water depth is the optimum distance from an existing parallel cable. And that's what we always try to achieve.
Right.
So you can reduce that a little bit to 2 times water depth if there's 3 times on the other side of the cable.
Ah, right.
So a lot of my time is spent looking at
Doing
existing
that math.
systems,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
measuring things. So that's just parallel cables. We also have to consider crossings where we cross in service cables.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the recommendation is to have a crossing angle of greater than 45 degrees, so we're not compromising as much of the existing system.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also have to consider third-party repeaters. So where they have a repeater, it's a point of failure, and they need to be able to recover and maintain that repeater if there's a
Right.
fault with it. So then we have to be 3 times water depth from the repeater as well at the crossing. So there's a lot of different rules to
Right.
consider before you even get to looking at the seabed
Right.
itself.
Right. Right. And so I think a couple of key points there to drive home. One, I don't know what else I thought it might be. Maybe something high tech like sort of underwater robots, right? The underwater equivalent of drones, right? I think they're called UAVs or something like this. But the idea, it's almost like surprising that what we do is we just drop a hook down there and pick up the cable, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, so and I can see how that this becomes problematic very quickly. But then also, I think just like with the internet, just like with so many things in our sort of geographic imagination, I think people forget that the seafloor itself is topographically very interesting, maybe even more so than land, if you will, right? So yeah, there's a lot going on down there that we have to think about, right?
Yeah, for sure. And sitting in the computer looking at contours and bathymetry, it's very easy to lose a sense of scale.
Hmm.
You see these big features on the seabed and you think, let's just route around this one here. But
Right.
you sort of look at the depths and you think, gosh, this is actually thousands of meters tall, sitting proud off the seabed. This is a huge
Yeah.
feature. It's obviously small on my screen, but it's very
Right.
easy to
Yeah.
lose that sort of sense of a
Yeah.
scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially because we can't go there, right? So,
Mm,
we're terrestrial beings, right? So,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, excellent, interesting. So how do you actually go about doing this? And this is a part where I'll plug looking at your actual paper. I think you can probably go to the Suboptic site and find those papers there. And if particularly for me, looking at your presentation that you gave, which has the animations or whatever of the visuals of doing this actual work that you're talking about, looking at these maps and where the cables are located. Take us through the sort of nitty gritty of how you actually do this. How do you know where these cables are? What are you doing with software to understand their relationships to each other?
Yeah, okay. So at the start of the project, we do a desktop study. So we
Hmm.
go out and we do a lot of research. Anything that might impact the cable, the routing of the cable, or the physical protection that we will apply to the cable. So we do that. We do some site visits. So we go to the actual landings and we look at the beaches, the BMH location, the CLS, um, and then we will rely on the databases that we generally have at Alcatel, and I'm sure they're
Hmm.
industry common databases. And we use a software package called MacI, which is a GIS based software package,
Hmm.
and we will load as much information into the software as possible,
Right.
and then load our route into the software, and then
Hmm.
we will just play with the route until we have a path that we're happy with. So we've got to design a route that's installable. That's really important. So our vessel has to be able to install it. It has to be able to place the cable on that particular bit of seabed that we want it to. So
Right. Which isn't as easy as it might sound, right? So.
yeah, in deep water when they're just surface laying, the layback is kilometers long. So they're trying to
Hmm.
control a turn way ahead of where the cable's touching down on the seabed. So
Right.
we have restrictions on how tight we can turn. We have restrictions on how close our turning points can be to each other. And then in the shallow water, when we're ploughing the cable, there's even tighter restrictions there
Hmm.
because they've got to be able to pull and steer the plough on the seabed.
Hmm.
So yeah, there's all this information we feed into our software, and one of the most important is the cable database. So Ocean IQ produce a cable database called the Global Marine Cable Database, and it's got
Hmm.
all known
Hmm.
existing systems in it. It's got all known old out of service cables, telegraph cables, coaxial
Right.
cables, out of service fiber optic cables, and also some repeaters.
Hmm.
And that's what we use quite a lot. So we use that to um, route around existing cables. And we also have our own sort of in-house database from our own experience installing these cables.
That is really interesting. So I'll tell a little story here. When I was in graduate school, I worked with this professor who was doing remote sensing of tree cover, and we had to go do like little, sort of field camp where we did ground truthing, and you would compare the imagery from the satellite to 10 square meter kind of survey of what trees were actually there or whatever. I assume you do something like that, like ground truthing, if you will, of comparing this submarine cable database to what you guys actually find.
Yeah, so we get to a position where we're quite confident with the routes we've got, and then we'll actually ask a survey subcontractor to
Hmm.
go and survey the route. So they'll go out and they'll collect some bathymetry data, but they'll also collect some geophysical survey data.
Hmm.
So they'll use things like side scan sonars, sub-bottom profilers, to survey the seabed to tell us what the depths are, first of all, so we know
Right.
water depths. They'll tell us the seabed classification, so they'll tell us whether it's rock or sand or just hard ground. And what they'll also do is tell us depth of cover, so they'll tell us how much sand there is above rock. So if we're burying the cable,
Mm.
we'll get an idea of how deep we're able to bury it.
Right.
And they'll also survey third-party cables. So they'll tow a magnetometer, which is just really a metal detector, effectively, and
Mm-hmm.
they'll identify and positively position third-party crossings. So we have a really good, confident
Right.
map of where they are, so we know where to lift up our plow and
Right.
deploy it again on
Right.
the other
Yes.
side. Yeah,
Yeah. The last thing you want to do is create more problems while you're trying to future-proof your own cables, right? So,
exactly. Yeah. And
yeah.
we always see an offset with the as found during the marine survey position of those third party cables and the database. There's always a bit of a positional offset.
That's exactly what I was getting at. Is sort of having to do the delta between the data set and reality, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, true in all data sets, really. But yeah, of course, excellent. All right, so let's get in a little bit more specifically to the geography of seabed congestion, if you will. So you mentioned already, sort of in the intro of why you did this paper, that there's physical geography to worry about, geopolitics, competing marine uses, things like that. How does that all translate into how you do your job? Why you thought this was a concern? And in particular, of course, like where in the world is it that we're worried about this?
Yeah. So cables obviously track population densities. There's more cables where there's more people,
Hmm.
which means all sort of cables are going towards the same places. Um, and where we have certain choke points, geographical choke points, geopolitical choke points, we end up having a really densely congested area with lots of submarine cables. Um, and the issue we're having is fitting in new systems in that area. And the certain areas I highlighted in the paper were the worst case scenarios, obviously, biggest impact. They're deep and they're congested. So they're deep, so
Mm.
so separation requirements. It's a function of water depth, so the separation
Right.
requirements are bigger.
Are greater.
Um,
Right.
and they're just very popular routes, and they're just classically popular routes. So we've always routed through these areas,
Hmm.
and there's just been an explosion of new cables through the three particular areas that I looked at.
Right. And some of that, of course, is just like you mentioned, popular. So ongoing joke in the sort of geography world that if you map any phenomenon, it's just a proxy for population, right? So, like,
Yeah,
but there's also some physical geography forcings here, right? So in other words, I would imagine like getting into the Mediterranean Sea, through the Suez Canal is a particular problem, for example, right? It's just a physical geography choke point, right?
yeah, absolutely. The Straits of Gibraltar,
Hmm.
that entrance to the Med is tiny and congested. Bab el Mandeb Straits, the southern point of the Red Sea, it's a
Hmm.
it's a real narrow stretch of water. Um, in Asia, off Singapore as well, there's lots of narrow channels, and where you get these narrow channels, they're usually shallow, which means you're going to have to bury the cable. And it's also quite common to have currents through these areas, like the Straits of
Hmm.
Gibraltar.
Hmm.
It's not a particularly good place for a cable. There's strong currents. It is a bit deeper, but it's not a suitable really location for a cable. But they're extreme choke points. You
Hmm.
don't need to go. You don't need to be that extreme. One of my examples was sort of the eastern Mediterranean, uh, north off the coast of Libya, below Crete,
Hmm.
which is it's quite a big area, but it is all the cables coming from Europe towards Egypt, which a lot of them do. They sort of route southeast from Europe towards Egypt to connect into
Right.
the Red Sea. They all have to route through this deep water section where you've got quite a narrow continental shelf off Libya, and we go straight down to sort of 2,000 meters water depth. So
Ah, yeah.
very quickly you're in deep water. So very quickly you're into this big separation requirement,
Hmm.
and that area now is really congested. Part of the presentation I did was to apply these 2 and 3 water time buffers to the existing systems, and then overlay all of those buffers. And when you turn it on, you've more or less got a full block of color. So
Right. There's no room left, basically.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's completely
Yeah.
saturated with cables. And that's
Hmm.
before you start looking at all the cables that we're planning to put in there.
Hmm. Hmm. That is really interesting. And again, I think to drive this point home that, you know, so much of the geographic information is an abstraction until you really look at it, right? That for me, as someone who doesn't work on this, like, you can look and see obvious choke points where the water channels themselves are narrow, but that the geography of the seafloor itself is really crucial to creating other bottlenecks that you wouldn't even just spot on a regular old wall map like I have
Mm.
behind me, right? So
Yeah, and because they're shallow, we don't have to be that far apart from an existing cable. So actually, in the Bab el
right,
Mandeb,
it's not that bad,
no, it's not that bad.
right?
You can get a bunch more cables in there, but
Fascinating.
in that the huge section of the Mediterranean, we're full.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
another example was the Gulf of Oman, where it's also a narrow stretch of water. It's the stretch of water off the Omani coast, which links the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean, large, um, and you are restricted there to the southern side of the Gulf because to the north you've got Iran, and
Mm-hmm.
getting a license or a permit to operate inside Iranian waters is very difficult. So all the cables are obliged to route through Omani waters, which
Hmm.
effectively halves the available space. And that's another example where I put in these buffers over all the existing systems, and it's completely full.
Right.
It's just you can't route another cable through that area, hundreds of kilometers without you can't do it and comply to ICPC recommendations. It's just
Right.
impossible, which means you're going to compromise either your ability to recover your cable and maintain it, or you're going to compromise somebody else's ability to recover their cable.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Well, when we were talking about this before, it made me realize that are probably got to be cases out there where someone's going to repair a cable, they drop down the grapnel and pull up the wrong cable.
Mm.
Right? But I'm not even sure how they would know that. I don't think the cable names are printed on the side, are they?
No, no, and we do find we do hook things we're not expecting to hook before an installation, before a burial installation. We'll do a route clearance operation
Hmm.
or a pre leg grapnel run. So we'll run a grapnel along the seabed, and we do hook up old telegraph cables,
Hmm.
ancient telegraph cables, things
Those are
that we're not
probably pretty
expecting.
obvious in terms of the different, housing technology and whatnot, right? So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and you can make a sort of judgment on the amount of marine growth on these things.
Right,
Um,
right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you mentioned the geopolitical forces, and you were sort of just talking about that. So often, when we're talking about submarine cables, of course, what gets submarine cables into the news, into the mainstream media news, right? So when some of my colleagues get to be on CNN or what have you, is when there's some big outage that causes a problem, but particularly when that outage could be tied to some geopolitical issue, Houthi rebels or pipelines in the North Atlantic that Russian ships were going by or something like this, right?
mhm.
That I assume is a very small part of what you're talking about. If when you say geopolitical, but really what you were talking about, the sort of more mundane of like which countries do I need to get a license from? Every country has their own regulator for telecoms, all these sorts of things. Um, is that the right balance? That the vast majority of what you're talking about there is really the sort of mundane licensing kind of issue, not thinking about where there's global conflict necessarily.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's not much we can really do to protect the cable from deliberate external
Right.
aggression. That's
Right.
really hard. We can bury it, but it's really difficult for us to actually protect it from that deliberate act. What if there's concerns about the vessels operating in a certain region,
Hmm.
then that will impact the routing that we might take. But that sort of decision making is taken before it sort of gets to my desk. Um,
Right.
there's new routes being developed, um, avoiding the Middle East,
Hmm.
avoiding the Red Sea completely, which just eliminates that whole, well, the threat from that area at least.
Right.
Um, but certainly in the Red Sea, in the Southern Red Sea, towards the Bab el Mandeb again, you've got Yemen up sort of north, and then you've got Eritrea on the other side. Yeah,
Hmm.
contacting the Eritrean government to get a license or to get a permit to work in their waters is notoriously difficult,
Exactly.
impossible for us. So,
Hmm.
like Iran and Oman, we're obliged to route through Yemeni waters. And
Hmm.
what that is doing now in more recent sort of times is pushing us towards the Yemeni coastline and pushing us towards the Houthi rebel controlled
Hmm.
Hodeidah area. So, and all the cables in the Red Sea historically have been surface laid because there's not much of a threat there from fishing, which was
Right.
the main historical threat. But it just exposes them all to this new deliberate external aggression, which perhaps if we could route it further to the west, towards Eritrea, we'd be able to avoid a bit more.
Hmm. But it's the friction of business, right? What's the cheapest, easiest thing to do in the near term? Especially given the unknown of the likelihood of that possibility. Exactly. So
Yeah, exactly. And a straighter route. We still
right.
competing with other systems across the Pacific, for example. Purchasers just want
Hmm.
the shortest route with the lowest latency, even if it comes at the cost of operational restrictions or higher risk to the cable itself.
Yep. Yeah, that lower latency is worth it,
Mm.
and really just more so now because AI, for example, which is like a buzzword now, but it's not a meaningless buzzword. It's actually a very very important, meaningful buzzword. There are a lot of cases, particularly the inference kind of stage, where latency really matters to the function, right? And so
Mm.
I think years ago the buzz in the not just submarine cable, but the telecom infrastructure industry in general is high frequency trading, these sorts of things, people doing arbitrage and low latency was really crucial. It's such a small market though that I think it got a little bit overhyped. Whereas I think with AI, there is really going to be an ongoing need to cut latencies down for a lot of the promise of these technologies to work well. That latency has to be top of mind for everyone, terrestrial and submarine cable. That's laying down infrastructure.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's such an important point for the customers. I know a system we're working on at the moment that they're constantly asking, what's the delta between our planned system and this existing system? It's
Hmm.
always a question that comes up.
Well, it keeps you busy, so that's good. Right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
yeah,
it's a
yeah,
challenge.
yeah. Excellent. So you've mentioned a few of the key choke points. Were there others in the paper worth bringing up here?
Yeah, the third
Geographically, I
one,
mean, yeah.
yeah, was off the coast of Japan, which has
Mm-hmm.
always been a busy area.
Mm-hmm.
It's deep, it's very busy with cables, and it's active tectonically. So there's a lot
Right.
of seabed activity. There's a lot of faults.
Right.
There's,
Triple threat there, kind of. Yeah, your
yeah,
earthquakes and I think I told you this, but we had on Mike Clare and Izzy Yo, who are in the UK based, doing studies of the seafloor themselves. They're geologists, and they mentioned a lot of things that again we hadn't really thought about, but that it's not just the obvious things like, oh, there's this volcanic flow coming off an island or an earthquake or whatever, but there's all kinds of seafloor movements that happen,
mm,
particularly when you have a lot of undersea topography, any kind of geologic activity that cause mudslides and all sorts of things that we are often thinking about up here on the land, but not under the sea. So you have to think about all of those, I assume, as well, right? So.
yeah, yeah, and the speed of flow on these things is incredible.
Mm.
Off the east coast of Japan, there's a deep trench. It gets towards 9,000 meters down there. If actually in
Wow.
excess of 9,000 meters. Yeah, it's
Wow, that is incredible. That the scale of that is
yeah,
just mind blowing. Yeah.
yeah, and a lot of cables route across it. But what you do see in the database that we use, it's all red lines, but you can see where a cable's faulted. They've had to recover it and
Hmm.
repair it, and when they do that, they have to deploy what we call a final splice, which is a bite. So you see a little
Mm.
kink in the cable.
Hmm.
And usually when I'm looking at the screen, I start seeing these kinks. I think, okay, there's faults in this area.
Right.
People have had to come here and repair. And just off the other side of this deep water trench, there's a lot of these little bites in the
Hmm.
cables. So it's a high risk, high fault area.
Right. Right. Yeah, and again, to your earlier point, population maps, right? Not only is Japan very populous, but also economically super important. Still, data centers like Tokyo is a very key data center location, even among the sort of greater populations of China for obvious reasons, geopolitical reasons, right? There's a lot of data that's stored and accessed from Japan. So I think all of this kind of works together to make your life hard, right? So,
Yeah, absolutely. And,
yeah.
and interestingly, off Japan, they've got they use cables for seismic detection, early warning
Mm,
systems,
hmm.
and a lot of fiber optic cables, internet cables, they're all generally routing in the same direction, so they're all nice linear routes running alongside each other, parallel. But these seismic systems don't care about that. They just
Mm,
want to have
hmm.
lots of cable on the seabed. So they're doing these big turns on the seabed, which
Right.
makes it very hard for us to navigate through and sort of apply our rules to
Gotcha.
do this.
Very interesting. So these cables that you're talking about, this is something honestly new to me, are not employed for other purposes like telecoms at all. They're really just employed by Japanese sort of geomorphologists or whatever, right?
Yeah, I can't. I'm not an expert on it.
Uh huh.
All I
That's.
know is that
I
the
mean,
science.
I didn't know that. Yeah, that's
No,
cool.
yeah, the scientific. So
Yeah.
whether they, I don't. I mean, they're sort of point to point in
Hmm.
Japan, domestic cables. So they're not like
Right.
Japanese festoon systems for the internet.
Right.
I think they are just purely scientific cables.
That is really cool.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
But again, making your life harder, right? So
yeah, a lot harder. Yeah,
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 yeah. Excellent. All right, so you've given us some good geographic examples why they happen, the different reasons, which I think, like I said, is particularly illuminating. No pun intended for our fiber optics here. But when you get to a place in the world and you see, like you said, kind of like just a big block of red of overlap, what do you do? What are your mitigation strategies? How do we solve this problem?
Well, yeah. So from a routing point of view, we just look for the least worst route.
Mm,
One
hmm.
thing to do is identify some of the older systems that
Mm,
are potentially going out of service soon. That's always an option, but they are still in service, so you do need to respect them. Really, they are operational. But some of them in Japan again go well beyond their 25-year um, lifespan, so
hmm,
you expect
hmm.
them to be out of service relatively soon. So one thing you can sort of target those systems and try and sort of route away from the newer systems that are going to be in service for a longer period of time.
Right,
Um,
right.
we do a lot of research into existing systems on the seabed in the database that we have to try and get some clarity from the owners. Are they still in service? And if they
Right.
are, when are they going to go out of service? So that's an option, but it doesn't solve the problem.
Hmm. But you can be a little bit less precious if what you're saying about if a cable's already 20 plus years old, even if they're trying to squeeze the last bits of life out of it, more important to be the proper distance from a cable that's RFS
Yeah.
date is coming or was a few years ago or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And these old systems, maybe if they do fault, they wouldn't even bother repairing them. I'm not sure. Yeah, one option is to identify older systems and perhaps relax the separation rules to get a bit closer to those, assuming they're going to be out of service soon.
Hmm.
Um, Another possible option is to identify areas where we are confident there's low risk to a cable. If the seabed's deep,
Ah.
it's flat,
Hmm.
it's benign, we're pretty certain there's going to be, we're not certain, but we're really confident the cable's going to be safe down there. In those
Hmm.
situations, we can probably also relax those recommendations that ICPC
Right.
have developed because there's confidence that there's going to be no fault. So that's another sort of solution. But in terms of the long-term strategy to mitigate this problem, something that is key is good communication between
Hmm.
installers, so Alcatel and our competitors, but also cable owners. So there
Hmm.
needs to be good, efficient, and encouraged communication between installers. And I say encourage because installers need to be encouraged by the cable owners to communicate with other installers and share information. So it's really hard to develop a new route when we don't have the full view of what's already on the seabed or what is already in
Mm-hmm.
development. So many
It's a
cables are
data
being
problem,
developed.
just like everything else in the world, right? So,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, and
yeah,
it's a willingness to share information problem.
right, right.
I appreciate there's concerns about security and people don't want to share routes for new systems, but it's
Mm-hmm.
it's it's very tricky to route a new system when you don't know who else is operating a new system in that area. Where it's
Absolutely.
congested, we're all targeting the same bit of good seabed, so naturally we're going to aim for the
Mm-hmm.
same areas.
That is really interesting because in my world, more of like sort of enterprise networks and things, this is a big problem as well, where a lot of carriers have obvious self-interest in not just sharing their sort of KML files or where exactly all of their last mile fiber is routed, but it's really important for both other carriers. If I want to be the diverse provider, I have to know where your cable is, so that where your fiber is, so that I don't overlap you. So that if someone is digging with a backhoe and forgot to follow protocol, like, it doesn't take us both out, right? But also from the customer standpoint, even sometimes they have trouble getting their carriers to share that actual, like, GIS level information, rather than just the general, like, oh, we connect from this area to this data center. But knowing exactly where it is a big communication challenge across the industry. And certainly one can imagine a world where that information is protected duly, is on a need to know basis, is covered by all the airtight NDAs or
Mm.
whatever, but is useful for the whole industry to know where all of this infrastructure is, so that we can better build and plan and that sort of thing, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. And the risk of not doing that is
Mm-hmm.
we seem to sort of get away with it, sometimes by the skin of our teeth, but it's a commercial risk essentially. If you plan a survey, which we do, and they're expensive operations, and then you find out post survey that that route's already been taken by another system, then you have to start again, and that's a huge
Right.
commercial risk,
Yeah.
for the sake of just sharing a KMZ
Mm-hmm.
or a
Mm-hmm.
GIS file of a route
Yeah.
with another installer. There are ways of developing and signing up to NDAs between installers so that we don't share this information.
Right.
But it's
Right.
certainly a big
Absolutely.
challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I suppose that's the reason for you coming on a podcast like this or whatever, is just to remind those kind of decision makers that, to convince their in-house counsel that
Mm.
that this kind of thing is worth it for them. Not just in general to the industry as a whole, right? So. What about from the regulators themselves? We're going through some new submarine cable regulations in the U.S. right now through the FCC. Again, that's one of the challenges of all this kind of infrastructure, is dealing with a fractured political environment, where all of these cables have to land. Do you think regulators should play a bigger role in sort of facilitating this kind of problem?
I mean, certainly their input's critical and it's really important, but what regulators like to do or like to propose is cable corridors. That's something we
Mm.
see developed in Southeast Asia.
Hmm.
And while that seems to be a really obvious and neat and tidy solution to congestion and seabed cables, it obviously creates a single point of failure. And you're right,
Right.
that you're putting all your cables in one place and they're all running parallel to each other. So if you have one anchor dragged across quite a small stretch of seabed, you're going to
Hmm.
end up with faulting a bunch of cables. So that's a concern. But I, I'm not sure what else. This is something I'm not particularly familiar with, so it's
Yeah.
hard
Yeah. No.
hard to
No
comment on.
worries. Yeah. Yeah. And this may be too. So by all means, we don't have to cover this, but I'm just curious. I touched on it before. If that what we're using is this, like you said, I think, like, you know maybe almost century-year-old sort of technology of dealing with this, of dropping a grapnel and kind of dragging it until you find the cable. Are there potentially new technologies that would make your job easier, like autonomous vehicles underwater or something like this?
Yeah, so we do in shallow water. We do have ROVs, and we do use
Hmm.
ROVs. So they will go down. and we'll pinpoint the fault, we'll find the cable, and the ROV will go down and clamp it, and we'll recover it with the ROV. So in those situations, there's no need to run the grapnel.
Right.
But that generally, I think down towards 900 meters is generally the max water
Right.
depth for that kind of ROV operation. So and anything beyond that just becomes very difficult currently with the current technology. So there's obviously potential there to develop better systems that are able to operate in deep water.
Right.
Because like you say, if you can completely remove the need to hook the cable with the grapnel, then you can reduce those
Right.
separation values massively. But that does require investment, and the offshore marine industry is crying out for general investment.
Right. Right.
Anyway, at Suboptic there was a lot of discussion about the age of the cable installation fleet.
Indeed. Yes.
It's all aging, so it requires quite heavy investment to bring it up to sort of modern standards. So it's another investment avenue that people need to consider.
Yeah. Well, in that case, hopefully there are some other, maybe slightly more lucrative use cases that the money can follow in terms of creating that technology, right? So, like cable repair ships are a very sort of industry specific thing that they require things that aren't obviously useful in other industries. But I wonder if maybe creating underwater drones might have a lot of applications that make it worth chasing that, perhaps. So, yeah. Excellent. Any other sort of mitigation strategies that you'd want to communicate to the industry, or is it really mostly about that sort of share your KMZ files and talk to each other?
Yeah, communicate. Yeah, I think that is in terms of mitigating. We're not going to solve the problems. The cables are there, but
Right.
communication is so important. And you know that's communication between installers, but purchasers and cable owners, I think, should have more of an obligation to communicate about their systems being retired. I think that's an important one.
Right. Right.
A lot of old systems appear on the database. We think they're in service. We have to treat them as in service, unless we have a sort of inkling that they are potentially out of service, and then we can do a bit of homework, and we find they actually are out of service already. So I think cable owners having a sort of obligation to notify the industry through the ICPC when a cable's retired would be a really positive step.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one because, of course, there, long-term observers of this industry, there was quite a boom in the early 2000s, right, with the big internet boom of cable building. So if I'm looking at my watch here, it's looking
Yeah.
like a lot of the cables in that boom should be just about ready to go out of service. So that seems like one that'll be particularly useful over the next couple of years, I would think. And
Yeah.
there's not sort of a boom going on over the next couple of years, right? So that timing isn't an accident, right? That this boom that we're seeing is the echo of the shelf life of the 2000s boom. So I think this is the key time for you to be giving this sort of call out to the industry, I would think.
Yeah, as soon as we hear a system's going out of service, even before it appears out of service in our database, we pounce on those routes.
Right, exactly. Make that call. Grab that real estate while you can, I suppose.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Especially if it appears like a good route that the cable's lasted 25 years, then that's
Right.
it's a proven route, so it gives us confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Well, this has been really fascinating, James. I appreciate it. And you didn't know this, but you tied it in so well with the other sort of episodes I'm doing in the submarine cable series, which is great. So just give us your brief review, kind of how you see this developing in the next few years. Like what you would like to see as you continue with your work over this next few years of, like I said, kind of a little potential submarine cable build boom.
Yeah, so I've really labored this point towards the end here, but communication,
Yeah.
working groups, at ASN we sort of try and champion this point quite a bit with other installers, getting together, communicating, having working groups with those engineers frequently, I think is a really obvious and potentially beneficial way to reduce the risk, get a better understanding of who's operating where, what's being planned, and how we can collectively reduce the risk and also improve the efficiency of the space that's left. Choosing routes that aren't, you might have to sacrifice some optimization of length. Just to tuck yourself next to an existing system to allow a bit more space for a new system in the future. I think having that foresight is probably quite good as well, taking that approach when you're designing new systems.
I wonder if there isn't room here, James, for you and some of your colleagues across the industry to start a new working group or something like that under the auspices of one of these groups, whether it's Suboptic and a Suboptic only every few years, or an ITW group or a PTC group. Something I'm sure you'd like to take this up in Honolulu next January. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Sounds good.
Yeah. On that note, if anybody listening, wants to reach out about this topic, how can they find you? How can they maybe find the paper? What's the best way to find you and connect?
Yeah, so the paper's on the Suboptic website. I think you mentioned at the beginning, you may have to sign up to be a member to actually access it, but it's there. I'm available. I'm at Alcatel in Greenwich in London, but you can also find me on LinkedIn if you want to reach out personally. It's a topic I am quite passionate about it. My day to day is heavily influenced by this issue we have. So I do enjoy discussing it and working on a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, that's all about reaching out. So it's interesting. I ask all my guests, of course, like, what's the best way to reach you? And it's very, very, very rarely someone's still saying something like Twitter, X, whatever, but LinkedIn really seems to be the place where everybody does all of their business social media now. So I think that it has won that game. Right? So,
yeah, for sure.
I created a Blue Sky account for like about 10 minutes and then it's back to LinkedIn, I guess. It is what it is. Right? So excellent. Well, this has been really sort of fascinating for me. And like I said, tied into the rest of this series, I think a really important point that, as I mentioned, gets really overlooked by even people within not just the telecom industry, but the submarine cable business, right? So I thank you for bringing your expertise to us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you very much.
Right. Cheers. Thanks for listening. Telegeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at Telegeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.